Hi, welcome to the bathtub, where when you hear this music, and you see this whiteboard with the words pointless and meaningless on the whiteboard, you know it's time for another episode of Pointless Adventures in Literature. Sometimes the adventures are pointless, sometimes they're meaningless, sometimes they're pointless and meaningless, but they're always pointless, meaningless, or both, and you can bank on that here at the bathtub. It's a promise we keep. We never break that promise. I'm going to move this out of the way because it gets in my way. It screws up all the light for some reason. And I wanted to talk this week about it's not really a meaningless adventure, and it actually has a kind of important topic. So I'm actually going to try to say something which is possibly right or wrong. I don't know. I don't really care so much as something that's bothered me for a long time. And the title of this talk is Why Johnny Can't Write. This is why kids don't really learn how to write anymore. And I do feel like it's kind of a sad case of American life. And I think it's kind of not the responsibility entirely of the kids. That's what I'm going to argue. So I want to start by saying that I'm an academic. I come out of academia. I went into academia, I guess, when I was in my 20s, and I enjoyed it. Like many of us who study literature, we love and hate the university approach to literature. But in terms of researching and study, and particularly a history of ideas and history of thought and cultural thought and so on, it was interesting. I enjoyed it. I had some great teachers. I had some terrible teachers. But basically, I enjoyed it, and I enjoyed teaching literature as well. And in the course of doing that, my graduate work, my PhD work, I wrote a dissertation and lots of papers along the way, like most of us do in graduate school. And I later directed some and worked with grad students on their own work. And I did a dissertation called Dreaming Revolution at UC Irvine, Transgression in 19th Century American Literature. Really looks boring. I mean, no one in their right mind would grab that off the shelf and want to read that. I don't blame them. And in the course of it, I wrote really, really boring, tendentious. There's not a life. There's not a sentence that comes to life in this whole turgid, kind of boring academic treatise. It's not something you want to read to your kids or read to yourself in the bathtub. But it covered some issues that I found interesting. Okay, so I did that, and I remember when I was writing it, you sort of learn the jargon of the world you're in. You learn the jargon of critical theory. You learn the jargon of the critical theorists and the historical theorists who write about, the people I was writing about, such as James Fenimore Cooper, talk about bad writing, and Edgar Allan Poe, and I forget who else I did. But Charles Brockden Brown. Anyway, those types of, it's the theorists who sort of influence you, and you start using and copying their stuff and sewing it together, and it's basically not very good writing, and it's not the sort of stuff that normal human beings write. It's not the sort of thing that literary writers write. It's an academic style. When I several years later, when I was teaching, and I had my first main job as a university teacher at the University of Connecticut, I got at the University of Iowa Press. Agreed to publish this after peer reviews and all that stuff. And they sent me a bunch of instructions, and they were perfectly okay. But the main thing I was concerned about was the writing in that thing was so horrible that basically I spent 6 months cutting about a third of that prose. I cut a third of it. And it's still not great. It's still written like academic, an academic shell. But it turned into a book I'm okay with, and I'm not too embarrassed by. But one third of it had to go. And that was sort of sensible. Okay, so I did a lot of academic work, and I decided after I got a job as an academic, and I was teaching mainly creative writing and then some academic courses, that I was never going to write like that again. It's awful. It's really hard to write good prose when you're writing that kind of stuff. It gets into you. You start imitating it. You start justifying it, and it's terrible. And you see everybody else around you writing that stuff, and it becomes really unpleasant. Anyway, I taught mainly literature, and I didn't teach something called composition. Now, I want to give a quick preface for our friends in Europe, particularly England. We have something in America called composition, and that's basically your first 2-year writing classes for college students. You don't really have anything like this in England. I taught in England for a while, and you didn't have anything like it. And I taught some writing courses that were sort of similar, but not at all the same. Here in America, everybody who goes to college or university has to take 1 or 2 or 3 courses in how to write. And tend to be called composition. Sometimes I call them writing courses, but they're still basically directed by people who have PhDs in composition theory. Okay, composition theory. I'm going to give you the names of a couple journals here. One's called Relevant Rhetoric, and then there's quite a few of these rhetorical journals which specialize in publishing essays by professors of composition studies. There's a PhD in composition. And this is people who write kind of really, talk about the tendentious crap I was writing, tendentious crap about how to teach writing. And they're really badly written. And the most horrible thing you notice immediately when you read these journals is that the people who are running the programs to teach kids how to write cannot write. They're just awful. And they're awful in the same way I was awful, but at the same time they're asked to teach writing, and they're transferring all this academic rubbish into these horrible classes that they start to organize, which seem to have nothing to do with actual writing. They seem to have nothing whatsoever to do with it. So I wanted to say a few things. Now, I was a very poor teacher of composition. I did my best, but I found that, like I would say, most of my American students were pretty bad writers. Most of them had very little help learning how to write. Most of them didn't really care about writing. They didn't read a lot, and so they didn't write very well, and it was really that simple. But what we were asked to do in composition courses, even when you're a graduate student, the first job they give you is teaching composition. I always said that should be your last job, because that's the hardest job you'll ever teach, is teaching composition. You got to teach kids to write, and then you're not really teaching them to write stuff they like. You're teaching them to write essays like compare and contrast essays, or based on rhetorical strategies. This has become very big, and I've talked to a lot of people in composition now, and I taught some comp courses here in California in the past few years. And rhetorical strategies, in other words, how to make an emotional argument versus make a logical argument, and how they're different, and how to organize the paper and the 5-paragraph essay, blah, blah. It's dry, boring. The students hate it. Most of the teachers hate it. And the main problem is the students don't try to write well. They're really trying to write the kind of crap they see in these professors who write these journals. They try to write that kind of crap. And they don't really look at the books, but when they do go in and look at the books, they see that writing. And they have no idea how to learn from that. So anyway, I taught in the university in the universities in England, and I had it a little easier teaching writing over there, because basically I could do what I wanted, and all I really did try to do with my students is teach them some basics of style. Style are just certain basic notions of how you organize sentences and put sentences together, and how you learn how to cut down like a half-page sentence, which often means nothing, and that's often true in all these academic essays you should not read. They go on for like a page and a half, and you try to cut them down and get the main point out as clearly as you can. Now, that's not that hard to teach students. If they pay attention, you can actually do a number of things with them. And so you try to give them a few rules and a few guiding tips on how to write. And I did that. And you would also, most importantly, I would always give them a book of what I consider pretty good prose, and I would say, here's a good writer. I often used Orwell. I often used George Orwell, who was actually very difficult for them to read. But I liked Orwell, and he's very relevant to what we're going through today. So I thought they were kind of interesting because he could deal with really complex subjects and make pretty good, clear arguments. Anyway, that was my whole gist. And I had 2 or 3 things I did. One is I made them keep a dictionary with them. So I had a rule. I said, carry a dictionary around with you. Instead of asking me what words mean, learn how to find words in the dictionary. Don't use the computer thing. Don't use those apps. Because one of the ways you learn language is you look at the word and then you see other words next to it, and you start to make connections between the words. You might just open the book at random and see a word that's interesting to you, and just browse through the book and get used to the words and just get used to having a dictionary around you. It's very hard with kids who are used to apps, and but most of them got into it, and I said you had to carry it with you everywhere. I also told them to get this. Strunk and White's The Elements of Style. Now, this is sort of the old standard style book. Everybody used this. Lots of writers called this their greatest book, and they all kept on their shelves and all this sort of stuff. And some writers considered the most important book. It was by a guy named E.B. White, and it was based on a set of about 20 or 30 principles that his teacher, William Strunk, had typed out and mimeographed and used to pass out to his students. Okay, it's not a particularly unusual book. All of the stuff that he says in this book are really common. They're in almost every textbook of writing you've ever seen, ever. One of the most important ones is use active verbs rather than passive verbs. Now, if you look at a typical academic piece of prose, I'm going to go see if I can find one right here. Okay, this is from someone who teaches creative. He teaches. He's a composition professor, probably. And I'm taking this at random. I'm not going to give the name or anything. Given the similarity of arrangement between two speeches, I would preface my analysis with two explanations that come to mind for why the On the Crown is an immortal rhetorical classic and Trump's rally speech is well not. The first is that Demosthenes' style is much higher moving. So all those ises and prepositional phrases are being linked together like this kind of train going nowhere. It's going to crash right into the well or whatever it's going to crash into. And it's just a bunch of pointless phrases linked together. And for the reader, you have to kind of figure out where they're going. And you don't know what the action of the sentence is. So passive verbs have often been considered not the way to think when you're writing strong prose. And for example, they mention that. They say you should try to use active verbs. It's in every textbook. Orwell has a famous set of I used to use this. There's a famous set of 6 tips by Orwell, and one of them is never use the passive when you can use the active. So it does not say never use passive verbs. It says don't use them when you can use active verbs. Perfectly sensible. It's been around for 1 million years. Okay, so there's a number of other things in it, which is you can look up as good examples. For example, my students, I could tell them, don't use active verbs, not passive verbs. And at the end of the term, they still didn't know what the difference was between active and passive verbs. You just had to kind of remind them every day. It also shows you what to do with modifying clauses and where to put them in the sentences, and has good examples. That's the only purpose of this whole thing. It's not. I never really read this that carefully. I hardly used this when I was learning how to write. But it was this perfectly. It's nice because it's small and they can carry it with them to class. So that was good. All right, and that's basically my entire approach. And I would work with them on some elements of what sentences were, so they could find the sentence had a subject, a verb, and an object. Most of my students had taken lots of English courses, and they still wrote sentences with 12 verbs, 15 nouns, lots of prepositional phrases so they could make the sentence longer and longer. And they really didn't know how to find the main important parts of each sentence. They just didn't know where they were. So that whole thing was that's my entire approach to teaching writing. And it tends to work okay. And then you have to try to, and the only thing that really works is that you need to, the only thing that really helps with students is to sit down with them and work line by line on what they write and help them revise and see how they can revise the sentences and cut out stuff that doesn't mean anything, because lots of their sentences don't mean anything, like that academic stuff that's out there. So learning how to choose the important parts of the sentences. Okay, so I came to America a few years ago, and I thought, well, I'll teach occasionally because I like teaching and make a little extra money. And I had experiences with a number of composition directors. I'm going to put them all kind of in one big bag, but a number of them at state and UC level educational institutions, people who are teaching fairly good students in fairly good universities, and courses the students had to take. And I remember when I was corresponding with one of the first people I worked with, they said, what do you use? I said, well, I like to use the elements of style. They really hate this over here now. This is really hated. It is really not worth loving. It's not worth hating. That's my personal feeling. It's just kind of handy. And they said, oh, yeah, okay, we don't really do that kind of stuff. I said, well, what do you do? And they said, well, we teach rhetorical strategies. And I had to find out that basically that doesn't mean too much. It just means logos, pathos, and ethos, I guess. That's the only thing ethical arguments, emotional arguments, logical arguments. And so they try to show you those three different things. Okay, so I had some resistance to this, and then I had real resistance at one university where I met a couple of the most unpleasant people I've ever dealt with, really, in universities, who were running composition programs. And I sent them something where I said, my normal standard pitch to my students. And one of the things I always say to my students is, I'm going to help you improve your prose. I can help you write better sentences. And I do feel that. It's not that hard to improve and write clear sentences as opposed to these jargony, horrible sentences. And I met a couple people who really were unhappy with me saying that. They said, you cannot tell people you're going to improve their work because it's very relative. So the first thing they said was that you can't really teach them to improve their work because it's relative what good prose is. Okay, so you got to go along with them. You're a boss. Okay, all right, do it. And then they say you cannot give people this book. It's proscriptive. It's telling people there's only one way to write sentences. And one of the guys it was a real hissy fit this guy gave me. He says, you should notice that this guy says you shouldn't use passive verbs, but he has lots of passive verbs in that book. I honestly, I remember looking at the guy saying, no one ever says you can't use passive verbs. They say you should try to use active verbs. And he said, oh, well, he was very upset. And you can't use it anyway. So I said, well, what do you use? And they said, well, we don't like to use anything. We don't like to use anything. I said, what about for grammar and issues of style? I said, well, you can sit and discuss it with them, and you can write good ideas on the board. But there's no standard. So there's no, again, a good set of principles. Again, this isn't like the tablets coming down from Moses. It's basically just guidelines for how you might want to rethink your prose. So they're very upset. So I say, fine. Well, what do I use when they want to know about how to use modifying clauses and so forth? And they say, well, there's this thing online. The school has an online database and has a big textbook on prose writing. And I went and looked at it, and it said all the same stuff, especially the thing about passive verb, active verbs. But what was clear, and I went and looked at these people's work, all these people I've met, they wrote this prose filled with ises, filled with prepositional phrases, filled with jargon, filled with all the crap that all these little technical manuals tell you not to. Even the manuals that they had in their own websites told you this. I remember saying to one of them that I talked to over the years, I said, well, can you, if you don't want me to give them what I consider good prose, do you guys have like a book or a set of text or set of essays that I can point them to and say, well, this is good prose? And they say, yeah, we have an online resource. And I went to the online resource. It was a bunch of terrible academic essays about rhetorical strategies and how to organize your desk and how to outline arguments. And stuff. It was just the sort of stuff no student would want to read. The other thing I told one of these clowns, I just think of them as all clowns now, is I like my students to have a cheap paperback dictionary in their purse or their bag or their back pocket, and to start getting used to words. This is kind of, and we would sometimes in class we would kind of run through the dictionary and look up words and try to have a little fun with them. And he said, you can't do that either. That's too much money. I don't like when students have to spend money. He did. This one guy didn't even have text in his class. Everything was online. So to tell them to go to a thrift shop and spend $1 on a dictionary, that was told they should have an app. Again, I honestly, I despaired by the time that was all over. So anyway, what I did learn is that I will never ever teach in American universities again as far as it comes to writing. It's become some horrible academic nonsense, and all the worst processes. You look at their writing, and they write this terrible prose, and then they run classes which don't even discuss how you write good prose. They don't even know the notion of good prose is something that doesn't exist. It's too relative. It's culturally relative. There's some truth in that to some extent, but for the most part, active verbs are better than passive verbs. Most writers know this. You can notice this as a reader, and it may not be. It's not going to solve all your problems, but it's certainly going to help. And again, you can read the 6 or 7 rules of Orwell, or you can go get this horrible online database that these people produce. So anyway, I learned at the end of this that I had a lot of students. Most of them just didn't care one way or the other. This was considered the class that they had to take. None of them wanted to take it. in the future, I see no future for English in the universities anymore, because I think they've been swallowed up by composition. And then in terms of teaching literature, I don't know how much time they have for teaching literature anymore. They're so busy trying to teach them this terrible way of writing, and then they've got all these kids who don't want anything to do with literature. I understand that. I don't imagine why anyone would want to take any literature courses after a year of composition. But we really have a university system, from what I can tell, all over this country, which teaches kids to hate writing. It teaches them to hate it. And it's taught by people who sort of seem to hate writing too. And that's the strongest I guess I could be. These are supposed to be more light, more fun. But I really, having a paperback dictionary in your pocket for $1 is not something you need to defend your students from in any university. And I'm afraid that it's a problem that we have in a country where even the universities have given up on the idea of books. It's all databases now. They just don't get it. They just think it's just stitching stuff together from different databases, and then you're done. All right, that's the end of my boring talk this week. That's the pointless and meaningless adventure in literature, but it was a meaningful term, which is that if your kids ever go to college and have to take courses in how to write, be very, very gentle with them. They're going to have a really tough time, and especially if they love books and they love writing, they're going to have a difficult year. And just give them a hug, I think, because I feel sorry for kids that have to take a writing course in our universities. Okay, take care.